Alright, greetings everybody, and welcome to my third part of my sort of mini-series, if you will, on early Soviet history. The first lecture I did dealt with the Russian Revolution and the events leading up to it. The second dealt with the Russian Civil War and the death of Lenin. And of course this lecture will deal with the rise of Stalin, and we'll continue with his story right up until 1939. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, when that is signed in August of 39, 1 week before the outbreak of World War II. And for certainly for Soviet participation in the Second World War, I do have a three-part series dealing with sort of the greater, the whole picture of the Second World War, of which the Soviet Union figures significantly in that as well. So for this lecture, we're going to really hone in on Joseph Stalin. There's so much to think about when we look at Joseph Stalin, and I should mention too that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, for a period there, the new Russian government under Boris Yeltsin kind of opened up the archives, if you will. Many archives, documents that had been kind of locked away and was not accessible to anybody. And there was a period in the early mid-90s where they opened these things up, and of course a plethora of historians and academics flooded into Moscow and St. Petersburg to kind of pour through these files. And what people were really trying to find out, I mean, there were many things, of course, that scholars were looking for when they were looking through the old Soviet archives, but one of the things that seemed to be missing in the narrative was a lot of details about the life, the early life of Joseph Stalin. It seems that in many ways, much of the history written about him mentions briefly his life in Georgia and then his role in the revolution, or lack thereof, depending on your opinion, and then right up into the 20s and 30s. So I think there was a tremendous amount of curiosity amongst historians to figure out what kind of upbringing Joseph Stalin had, because we know a lot about the horrors of the 1930s and the purges and collectivization and all these things, and I think people were really very curious what it was in his childhood that maybe led to Joseph Stalin. And what those historians and academics discovered was quite a remarkable portrait of Joseph Stalin as a young man. So I'm really hoping to kind of dig into this piece, because one of the sort of recurring themes you may recognize if you've watched a couple of my lectures is that I've always been very fascinated with the role of personality and leadership. The role of the conditions in which shape certain leaders. What was it about their upbringing? What was it about their personalities that made them great leaders or tyrannical leaders or what have you? And that's why I've always been fascinated with so many leaders, is to make that link with their personality. The Kaiser Wilhelm II, I've talked about in great length in my Causes of World War I lecture. He's a fascinating character. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for completely different reasons, very, very fascinating character because of his personality and who he was as a person. So coming back to Joseph Stalin, you know, a lot of people were trying to figure out what on earth happened to this guy that made him so malevolent, yet so clever, so cunning, so ruthless, so Machiavellian on many levels. And I'm hoping that today I can share some of my thoughts on how he grew up. And a lot of my understanding of Stalin as a young man came from one particular book called Young Stalin. I believe the author is Simon Montefiore. If you get a chance, it's incredibly well written, very engaging, almost written as sort of a narrative piece. It's like a narrative history, I guess. It really brought to light so many elements that helped me understand why Stalin was who he was. Because it's a hard thing to figure out unless you can understand where he was coming from and how he was raised. Here's some pictures we should look at too. This is kind of a typical image of Stalin during the war, always looking pristine and perfect, good looking, great mustache, great hair. There's Stalin looking relaxed in his easy chair. There's Stalin right next to his greatest comrade, Lenin. Of course, we now know that that relationship was really fabricated, and the propagandists of the 1930s really perpetuated this myth of Stalin and Lenin having this close relationship. And there, of course, is one of the pictures that was found in these archives. You can see he was quite a strikingly good-looking young man, and he certainly had no issues with the ladies. He knew how to work a room. You know, he wasn't really someone who exhibited a lot of insecurity, and that, of course, goes right up to the end of his life. So, a lot of very interesting looks at Stalin. So let's go back. Now, I don't know how well you can see this map. I'm finding that sometimes if my maps are too bright, they're a little bit dim, but if you can make out the Caspian Sea here, and the Black Sea, and then the Mediterranean. Here you can see part of the bottom of the boot of Italy, Greece, Israel, Syria, and the Ottoman Empire, and then Iran, Iraq. Here's Georgia. Georgia is like the southernmost point of Russia. In fact, the people of Georgia have it almost sort of a little bit of an Arabic look. They're so very, very close to, as I say, Iran and Iraq. And when you look at Joseph Stalin, I remember one student saying to me, geez, Mr. Tolman, Joseph Stalin looks a lot like Saddam Hussein. And I've often thought, well, I think Saddam Hussein kind of modeled himself after Stalin, but there is also those sort of ethnic links too, that, you know, the mustache, the hair, the complexion, you know, and because he is coming from, you know, the southernmost point of the Russian Empire. Georgians, of course, spoke a different language as well. So, you know, very, very much on the outside of the empire. So, Stalin was born in 1878 at Gori, Georgia, which was described in this wonderful book I was talking about as sort of a lawless, violent town. The best way for me to kind of give you a sense of what Gori was like is it was almost like a frontier Wild West town with a saloon and gunfights and a minimal law, you know, maybe one sheriff trying to oversee the community. It was very much described as a very, very violent, lawless place. And I'll give you an example of the kind of things that went on in Gori. There was an annual festival that would occur in Gori. And I'm not sure, it probably still continues to this day, but to a less degree would it be violent as it was back in these days. But it was an annual festival to celebrate a Georgian victory over, you know, Iran. Of course it wasn't Iran, it was Persia in those days. A Georgian-Persian war where they were victorious, and I guess it became this yearly celebration, and people would come into the center and they would drink, and there would be like brawls and street fights and chariot races, and I mean it was really, like I say, something out of the Wild West or out of ancient Rome. You know, out of this sort of community of sort of lawlessness, you know, Stalin would be born and would be raised in this community. Now, he was born extremely poor, and by the way, his name was not Stalin when he was born, it was Joseph Jugashvili. Just don't ask me how to spell it. I got it written down somewhere, but Jugashvili, it's a very long name, and I'll explain why he changed his name from Jugashvili to Stalin a little later. What we do know about his parents is pretty straightforward. There aren't a huge amount of details, but a picture began to come together through the archives. His mother was extremely conservative, a devoted religious woman, prayed regularly, lived a very, very pious life, didn't drink. Her husband, Joseph's dad, was a cobbler. And a cobbler is like a shoemaker. So he made and repaired shoes and had his own shop. Unfortunately, Joseph's father had succumbed to the evil temptations, if you will, of alcohol. And he had become an extremely chronic alcohol user. And as a result, unfortunately, he became extremely unstable and brutally violent with young Joseph. In fact, there were incidents where when Joseph would come home from school, he would look in his window to see if his father was home, because sometimes his father would come home early if business was slow at the shoe shop. And if he saw his father in the window, he would sit in a park across the street and wait until his father passed out from the drink before he would come home, because he knew if he came home before his father had gone to bed, he would likely be beaten or abused. And it was horrible for Joseph, because he saw how violent his father was with his mother too, and that made things very, very difficult as well. As a result of this incredibly abusive relationship, the community, the neighborhood within Gorey where he lived, people in the community were also very concerned, because everybody knew that Joseph's father was a brutal tyrant when he drank, and he drank all the time. So his mother gets the nerve to have him kicked out of the house, and actually the community gets involved to some degree, and I'm pretty sure Joseph's father ended up just more or less living in his shoe shop where he would have a bed, and he resented very much being kicked to the curb this way. But his mother, it was a life or death situation for her, and there were many times where he would come to the house banging on the door and drunk, and trying to drag Joseph back to the shoe shop, because Joseph's father was committed to having his son become a cobbler himself. So Joseph's mother struggled, and she was a washerwoman. She would go to people's homes and wash their clothes, fold their laundry. And young Joseph began to try to help as well. And one of the things that, there's many things about Joseph that's very interesting. He had apparently this beautiful singing voice, very high voice, and he would be hired to sing at Georgian weddings, where he would sing sort of traditional Georgian folk songs. So, it's an interesting side of Stalin you never would imagine. But so he made a little extra money singing these folk songs. His mother really wanted to break this cycle of poverty in which she lived in, and as a result Joseph lived in. So in the years that she did washing and he did singing, she wanted to get him into the seminary, because the seminary was seen as the education in the seminary was seen as a gateway to a better life. So he attends this seminary, but because of his father, because of other male role modeling, I think Stalin had a real issue with male authority figures, and I think you can appreciate why. But despite that, he used to challenge his teachers on a regular basis. He would ask them questions that he knew would sort of perturb them or upset them. He might say, put up his hand, for example, and say, yes, Joseph, you have a question? Yeah, I'm just curious. Karl Marx said that religion is the opiate of the people. What do you think of that? That kind of thing. So, he would do... his teacher said that he was very bright and capable, but he wasn't really interested in working that hard. Where he excelled, though, it's another side of Stalin that will surprise you, was in poetry and writing. In fact, he was published in a manuscript of some kind, and his teacher said that he has the makings of being a great poet, and that had he pursued his writing career, but once he finished the seminary, he very well could have gone down in history as this great poet instead of this ruthless dictator. How's that for irony? The problem was he was not interested in school. He, as I say, he had this sort of resistance to male authority figures, and he drops out of the seminary right at the tail end of his education. Because by that point in his life, 16, 17, he was beginning to connect with some pretty shady characters in the community that were interested in, making money in illegal ways. So And his natural rebelliousness drew him to revolutionary activity. He was drawn to revolutionary activity because it was violent. It was resisting authority. You know, I mean, he got involved with some people that were like robbing banks. They were doing high-speed chases of trains and robbing trains, something out of a Jesse James narrative in the Wild West of Arizona. He got involved in piracy on the high seas of the Black Sea. I mean, he was getting involved in all kinds of illegal activity, but, you know, because there was such a ineffective structure of law in Gorey, you know, he got away with murder, like so many did. So he was very, very interested in, and some of these people he was hanging out with were pretty rough around the edges characters that were willing to commit acts of murder as well. When he began to read a little bit about Marx, of course he was drawn to Marx, but then when he read about Lenin, he was absolutely fascinated with this Lenin character. And the more he read about him, the more he wanted to meet Lenin. And eventually, as a young man, he does make his way to St. Petersburg to meet the great hero who's written so eloquently about Russia and the conditions in Russia and what should be done. And, you know, it should be noted that when Lenin first met Stalin, he said, "I have just met a fine Georgian." What Lenin saw in Stalin was a revolutionary of the fist. What I mean by that is that people like Lenin and Trotsky, these guys were intellectuals. They were not necessarily murderers themselves. But in order to have a political movement that its ultimate goal is revolution, you need people on the ground that are willing to do the grunt work, the fighting, the killing, if you will. And I think, in fact, I think Lenin used the word a magnificent Georgian is what he said. What he saw in Stalin in the early days was somebody who was going to be on the ground fighting the good fight. So he knew that he needed people like Stalin, and Stalin would bring him money, bags of money for the Bolsheviks that were, you know, taken from his high seas robbery and train robberies and bank robberies and everything else. So interesting stuff. There he is there, some more pictures. There's a colorized version of the picture. As you can see, quite a strikingly good-looking man. Once he connected with Lenin, as I said, Lenin recognized that people like Stalin were going to be necessary. And also the fact that Stalin was coming from a poor background, which of course could be seen as a major asset in a communist organization. Coming from a poor family made him popular with many communists, changed his name to Stalin in 1913, which means steel. Okay, was it that simple? Maybe a little bit more complex than that, but part of it was he just got tired of signing his name on documents, Jugashvili, and people are going, what does that say? So he didn't want to be writing Joseph Jugashvili. He wanted something quick, he wanted something snappy, he wanted something like Lenin, right? Oh, Lenin's good, it's just quick, it's easy to understand, quick to write. Lenin, Stalin. Lenin, Stalin, Stalin, Lenin. Aha, it's got a ring, 5 letters, ends with an N. So he changes his name to Stalin, which means steel, or man of steel. Which is an interesting choice. You think about, what does that say about his sense of confidence, you know, when it'd be like, I'm going to call myself Iron, man of iron. People would look at me like I had 2 heads. Are you kidding me? We already have an Iron Man. We don't need another one. So it's interesting to me that he would choose to call himself Stalin, but it worked well, it was easy to sign, sounded like Lenin, so it all worked. During the revolution, though, as he began to hang out more in St. Petersburg in 1917, he was actually an editor of the newspaper Pravda, and he would basically be more reporting on the revolution than he would be participating in it. You know, and later when we get to the 1930s and we ask ourselves, why the heck did he go after all his old comrades in the Bolshevik Party. A lot of it had to do with the fact that because they knew what he didn't do in 1917. And when Stalin was trying to cultivate this heroic image of him and his relationship with Lenin and also his role in the revolution, he couldn't have people around that knew what he didn't do. So, interesting. 1922, Lenin appoints him in a position called General Secretary, which was a minor post, but one which Stalin expanded after Lenin's death. He became known as Comrade Card Index. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about how many of the intellectual Bolsheviks viewed Joseph Stalin. Most people in the party didn't care for him. They thought he was dirty, he was dumb, he was a gray blur. You know, he's kind of there, but he's not really. They put up with him because Stalin Lenin quite liked him. Although Lenin's opinion about Stalin does change. He gives him this position, which really is a kind of a secretarial position. And like I say, those other Bolsheviks referred to him as Comrade Card Index. But here's the trick, though, is that within the role of General Secretary, he was in a position where he could appoint people to positions in the government. Okay? So, Bob's applying, he's an engineer, we're going to appoint him Minister of Engineering. Oh, Bob's a forester? Great, Bob, we're going to appoint you the Ministry of Forests, so on and so forth. So what seemed like a secretarial position turns out to be one that is very influential because everybody wants to win Stalin over so they can get the appointments within the party that they want. A power struggle develops after Lenin's death between Stalin and Trotsky, and Stalin is now looking for allies within the Communist Party. Now, a couple of things about Lenin's death and also about Lenin's will. When Lenin dies, the man in charge of organizing the funeral, I believe, was Joseph Stalin. And he was already thinking about taking over but nobody in the party ever would have thought of him as a leader because he was seen as this gray blur, as kind of a dirty peasant. And so he organizes his funeral, and apparently one rumor, and I don't know to what degree, I've read this in several sources, but I would check your sources as well because there's a variety of stories, but this is the one that I quite like, is the idea that he organizes this funeral. Of course, he's the head mourner at the funeral, with a handkerchief and tears. But he managed to give Trotsky, his future rival in the position to take control of the Communist Party after Lenin's death, an invitation with the wrong date. And I guess everyone was at the funeral going, geez, where's Trotsky? Why isn't he here? And Stalin says, I don't know, I gave him an invitation, I don't know what's going on. So right off the bat, you can see that Stalin is already beginning to kind of work things in such a way that works to his advantage. Another thing I've heard is that Trotsky was quite ill, but I like the idea of thinking that Stalin gave him the wrong date of the funeral. So anyway, so Stalin is looking for allies to gain a majority in the Politburo, which is the governing body of the Soviet Union, in order to shuffle his way to the top. So he begins to connect with people. And certainly people are going to be willing to support him because he is still General Secretary. Generally, what you have is clearly it's a two-way fight between Trotsky and Stalin. And Stalin is claiming that his focus for the future of the Soviet Union is something called socialism in one country. Basically what he's suggesting is that we can't really be worrying too much about world revolution right now. We will certainly do our best to support parties around the world, but our primary focus is to build socialism in the Soviet Union. So it's got a greater degree of stability than Trotsky's idea, which is permanent revolution. That is, that the revolution needs to be in a constant state of change. It can never reach Thermidor. to use a term from the French Revolution, where revolutions cease being revolutionary. Part of permanent revolution was the idea that we need to continually support communist parties all over the world, that our goal is to advocate world revolution. Now, after all those years of war, revolution, civil war, people were really quite interested in stability, particularly by 1924-25, when Lenin's new economic policies seemed to really be working. So those were the two platforms. Stalin appeared to represent stability, and Trotsky more struggle and hardship. Trotsky had several advantages, though. Let's look at this. Number one, he was Lenin's choicest successor. He was strong. He was a strong person with intelligence, well educated, was popular with the army. He was the leader of the Red Army during the Civil War, and he played a leading part in the Revolution and the Civil War. Coming back to Lenin's will, which I digressed from earlier, in Lenin's will, which Stalin managed to have suppressed, which is interesting, in Lenin's will, he made it very clear that his chosen successor was Leon Trotsky. And he also said in his will that Stalin needed to be removed from his post, that he was rude and crude, and he didn't trust him. So obviously what Lenin saw in Stalin in the early days of the 20th century that he liked, he began to see tendencies in Stalin that were troubling. Now, why Lenin didn't just take care of that himself before he died, because he certainly would have had the authority to remove Stalin from his position as general secretary and shuffle him to the back line of party hierarchy, but he didn't do that. However, he makes a very, very strong statement in his will, and that will was suppressed. The information was not released. So it was Stalin, however, who would be successful. And it's quite interesting, why did Stalin succeed over Trotsky, who had everything that appeared to be in his advantage? Trotsky lacked support in the Politburo because he had not joined the party until 1917, so that was a bit of a liability. Stalin had been there since the beginning. Trotsky and others underestimated Stalin because he seemed simple. This is the thing, because he was a Georgian, he had a funny accent, he was rough around the edges, everybody underestimated him, and that was a huge advantage for Stalin. As General Secretary, Stalin controlled appointments and placed people in positions who supported him. This, in turn, instilled loyalty. This is very important. If you want to keep your job, you want to support Stalin, right? So that was that's the interesting thing with the appointment of Lenin, giving him that position of General Secretary. Really gave him a lot of power. And also, as we said earlier, Stalin was chief mourner at Lenin's funeral. That looks good for the pictures and for the history, right? Stalin used propaganda effectively to show how close he was to Lenin. And that becomes more and more pronounced throughout the 30s, where he becomes at Lenin's side throughout the whole revolution, right? His confidant, his best friend, right? So he really, really fabricates this myth of being such an important part of the 1917 revolution. All right, so his conniving and alliances continue. Now, when Lenin dies in 1924, Stalin doesn't gain firm control till 1928. So in that 4-year period, there is jockeying for control. There is maneuvering amongst alliances. And Trotsky was not nearly as Machiavellian as Stalin. I think Stalin just ran circles around him when it came to pitting others against him. So 1926, Stalin allied himself with Nikolai Bukharin against Zinoviev and Kamenev, only to expel him in 1929 as well. So you join me, I get from you what I need, I push you away. It's this massive chess game that he's playing, eventually to get his king to the final round, right? So he had everybody running in circles, which is quite remarkable because he was seen as the gray blur, right? Stalin proved to be anything but mediocrity, which is what they all thought of him. He was more of a master schemer and a tactician. And by 1929, probably more by 1928 I should say, but all potential opposition was removed and Stalin would begin his reign, which lasted until 1953. By the time he takes the full reins in 1928 into 1929, he is the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. In addition to that, I should note that he has Lenin, or rather Leon Trotsky, his former rival, kicked out of the country. And he's actually shackled and kicked out. And Trotsky would head to Mexico, where he lived until his death in 1940. And in Mexico, he would continue to write actively against Stalin. And he wrote histories of the Russian Revolution that really put Stalin in a very unflattering light, and with good reason. I mean, certainly he suffered under the cleverness, if you will, of Joseph Stalin. And eventually, Stalin would become so irate with the pamphlets and books and things that Trotsky was writing that he sent an assassin to Mexico City to have him assassinated. And ironically, Stalin, or rather, these names, Russian names, are always get me. Trotsky would be assassinated by the assassin who hit him on the head with an ice pick. And he lived for a couple of days in the hospital, but then he would die. And I'm thinking, what the heck, why not, I mean, not to sound crass, but an ice pick? And when he brought it in, did he buy it in Mexico? Can you buy ice picks in Mexico? And did he bring it with him from Russia? And when he got to the border at customs, what did he tell them? Oh, why are you bringing an ice pick to Mexico? Oh, I don't know, might do some mountain climbing. I mean, I don't know. It's just a strange thing. But so, you know, pretty horrible end for Trotsky. But, you know, Stalin's last vocal rival would be extinguished in 1940. So, initially making good on his promises, he would implement his first 5-year plans in 1928. So coming back to this idea of his platform of socialism in one country, his primary concern, with good reason, you can't knock him for this, is that Russia needs to modernize. Because he knew, as well as all the Bolsheviks and governing officials in the Politburo knew, that nobody wanted them to succeed, you know, in the West. So Stalin believed Russia must catch up to the West in 10 years or be crushed. Now stop and think about this for 1 second. Catch up to the West in 10 years. All right, well, let's look at Great Britain. How long had they been industrializing for in the mid-1920s? Well, if you go back to the textile industries, way back when, you could argue that Great Britain had been actively moving towards modernization and industrialization for maybe 100 to 150 years, and Stalin wants to do it in 10? That's a pretty bold claim. Focus would be on heavy industry, coal, iron, steel, and oil, and his methods were brutal. People's lives were uprooted. They were, you know, yes, some people did volunteer to work in these new factories, but a lot of people were forced into them, where you would be working long hours, you would have to carry work cards, there'd be severe punishment for tardiness, drunkenness, and what have you. So what Stalin creates is a pretty brutal system of forced labor. And I don't know if there's a softer way to put it, because when people began to work in these factories, they found themselves completely trapped because they were not allowed to go anywhere. They couldn't just leave because they didn't like the job. They were worked to the bone. And this was part of Stalin's obsession with getting Russia to a place where they could someday defend themselves should the Western Allies or anybody else invade like they did in 1918 and 1919. The second plan continued with heavy industry and the third on consumer goods, but the threat of war switched production to armament. So By the third plan, he wanted to kind of soften things up a bit and make things better for Russian people, because he realized at this point how contentious his agricultural policies had been. But the threat of Nazism and war shifted them back to heavy industry. So, all right, this is some propaganda images. This is a pretty light image, nothing too forcefully strong. This says here in Russian, "For the betterment of the Soviet people, we are building an electricity plant." So, all right, okay, let's look at agriculture. So, if you are going to modernize Russia and uproot hundreds of thousands of people and herd them into these factories, they have to be fed. You need a robust agricultural sector, and if you're going to put people in state-controlled factories, then you are going to do the same in agriculture. And it's called collectivization, and we'll talk about that as well. 1929, he implements collectivization. Okay, let me just explain this because it confuses a lot of people. Let's say during the Tsar's time, you and your family lived on 10 acres of land. It was owned by somebody, but you tilled that land for your lord. And life was tough, but you always had enough to eat. You had your own home, and depending on the relationship that you had with your lord, life was tough, but it was tolerable, and you just mucked it out from season to season. You still had your own supplies. You still tilled your own crops. You had a certain control of your work week, if you will. But this is what collectivization says. Collectivization says that all these small farms located next to each other are all going to be brought in together, right? All these farms, and all the equipment that these individual families and farmers have are going to be shared together, and now you're all going to be tilling the land together. And by the way, everything that you thought was yours, your shovels, your picks, your hoes, everything else, that's no longer your stuff. That's owned by the state. And this land that you till on, nobody owns. It's owned by the Soviet people, by the state. Now, what makes this so contentious is that what if you don't like your neighbor? What if you work harder than your neighbor? What if you've had a falling out and you don't want to share your stuff? You are forcing people to work together who maybe don't want to. And so people begin to resist. And much like the period of war communism, when there was grain requisitioning by Lenin's government during the Civil War, the early stages of collectivization had this kind of impact. Many people resisted, and the Red Armies brought in to enforce Stalin's ironclad law. Now, I say 5 million died, and I can't say with absolute certainty how many. I've read multiple sources on this. This figure does include, though, the victims of the Ukrainian famine of 1932-33, which we'll talk about, because it was in the Ukraine where we had a whole nation or a group of people within the boundaries of the Soviet Union resist collectivization. That's where the great agricultural land was. That's where the breadbasket of Europe was. And the Ukrainians were not interested in this top-down, heavy-handed approach of state-controlled agriculture. As we said, the Ukraine resisted and was punished, leading to a devastating famine in 1932-33. What Stalin does is he says, if you guys are going to behave yourself and do what you're told, then I'm going to quarantine you. I'm going to cut off road links and railway links, and I'm going to leave you in there just to starve. And what actually ends up happening is that the horrific conditions that the collectivization policies implemented on the Ukrainian people, because it was horrific because the state demanded more than they could produce, so that's a problem. You need leftovers for the people that live there. Well, now he's completely isolated them, and what ends up happening is people begin to starve. And you know, this period of Ukrainian history is man-made. This is not just weather conditions and a lack of rain and poor crops. This was instigated by Stalin's brutal tactics, and it is in a way, I mean, certainly it could make a justification. Holodomor, I believe is what this is called. It's what the Ukrainians call it, has been deemed a genocide. I mean, I think that, I don't know if it has been officially stated as a genocide, but I would put it up there, certainly, because it was man-made and it was not simply based on the weather. By 1937, though, 90% of farms were collectivized, in many cases against the will of the farmers, but concessions were made to the kolkhozs, which were voluntary cooperatives. In other words, there were farms where people said, look, this is how we want to do it, we will work together and produce, we want to make our own decisions, but we will still continue to give X amount % to the state. Maybe the kolkhozs did a little better. They had, oftentimes the kolkhozs were on better land, so they had the ability to produce more, but still, whether it's state controlled or by consent by a group of farmers, all of the agriculture was inevitably under state control. You know, and one of the things that's interesting, and I think Stalin made this quote, but he didn't make the quote. I believe it was either Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Napoleon, one of those two, I think, made the quote that you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. So when outside observers began to, come in, I mean, because throughout the 1930s, people would be invited to look at the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet government would take them on a tour of all the best case scenarios, and very, very tightly controlled. But there are a couple of people who could see under this facade there was some pretty brutal cruelty going on. And one reporter said, why are you killing so many people? Why are so many people dying in the Soviet Union in your movement towards modernization? He says, well, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. So, he had no bones about what he was doing and why he was doing it. So, and some more pictures. These are of peasants, who are demanding seizure of farms worked by better, There's a lot of jealousy amongst collectives that, if your neighboring collective had better land and better access to water and they were producing, you had this kind of anger and resentment, but still you get this kind of imagery of Big Uncle Joe, smiling Soviet people, and look at these tractors. And I believe they did purchase quite a few tractors from the United States after Franklin Roosevelt opened up relationship with the Soviets in 1930, I don't know if it was 33 or 34, but it was very early in Roosevelt's career that he decides to open up diplomatic relations. So I know a lot of trucks and tractors were American made. All right, well, despite the hardships faced by people in agriculture, there is a storm brewing by the early 1930s. Stalin is becoming increasingly discontented with people that he thinks are undermining him. Stalin remembers very well those people around him who were not loyal to him, those people that criticized him, those people maybe in the Red Army who were actually former Tsarist officers, and he took note of all these things. He certainly took note of the fact that there were still a significant amount of people within the Politburo who knew, as I said earlier, what he didn't do in the revolutionary period. And if you're going to continue to fabricate this myth of you being second-hand man to Lenin, then you're going to have to eliminate any opposition that might know otherwise. Stalin was a little guy. He was only 5'5", 5'6", but he had these yellow tiger eyes that were described by those who knew him, and he could look right through you. I mean, he was an incredibly tough as nails guy. I mean, judging by his, now we know where that comes from with his life in Gori and in Georgia as a young man. And he did not lack confidence, and you did not want to cross this man because he was beginning to demonstrate his willingness to eliminate anybody who would oppose him. And, just to come, before we get into the Kirov situation here, when you are a government official in a dictatorship, run by someone who is brutal as Stalin, you got to be very, very careful what you do and what you say and how you do it. And and I've said this before in other lectures, that when we've talked about Stalin and dictators in general, but particularly Stalin, you didn't want to kind of ingratiate yourself too much, or suck up to him, as we might say, because he might begin to say, hey, what's with you? What's with all this being nice to me stuff, So if you didn't take that approach, you might say, well, I'm not gonna say anything. I don't want him to get mad at me. And then he might say, so, Bob in the back, you never say anything back there. What are you up to, right? So you got to find that balance, right? And I think that people began to live in an absolute state of fear about making sure that they're on Stalin's right side. I mean, Nikita Khrushchev was one of the few that I think had a good sense of humor and had a kind of a slap you on the back kind of a joking manner that Stalin quite liked. So I think that Khrushchev recognized it. He found his way to Stalin by using humor and being gregarious and all that kind of stuff. So what happens in 1934 is this fellow here, Kirov. I believe the Kirov Ballet is named after Sergei Kirov. Sergei Kirov was a very passionate, good-looking, great people skills kind of guy. People loved Kirov. In fact, people used to nudge Kirov and say, geez, Kirov, you'd be a great leader. Stalin's just too harsh. You'd be our guy. And Kirov was not interested in being the leader of the Soviet Union. In fact, he was given the job as leader of the Communist Party in Leningrad, which has become Leningrad from Petrograd. Crazy. St. Petersburg, it gets confusing. St. Petersburg turns to Petrograd during the war. And then, of course, when Lenin dies, Petrograd becomes Leningrad. When the Soviet Union collapses, it becomes St. Petersburg again. So it ends where it starts, but kind of confusing. But he is now given the job of being in control of the Leningrad Party, and he's very happy in this position. The problem is that Stalin knew that Sergei Kirov was very popular, very well liked, and Stalin could probably pick up on the fact that people were not too happy with the way things were going, even though people would never ever tell him that. So Kirov is walking home from work one day, and he is mysteriously assassinated on the streets of Leningrad. Well, Stalin takes this as an opportunity to say, we have enemies within. The great Kirov has been killed, and we are going to find the assassin, and we are going to destroy our internal enemies. Now, many believe that Stalin himself gave the order to have Sergei Kirov assassinated so he could get rid of a potential rival, and he could also use it as an excuse to declare a form of martial law and begin to clean up, if you will, his country. What happens after this Kirov assassination is a process whereby the next 4 years we see mass arrests and mass executions. Anyone deemed a threat to Stalin would be executed, resulting in a prolonged period of terror where millions would be killed. I don't know the exact figure. I know it's in the millions. This is in addition to the 5 million that died during collectivization. And this doesn't even touch the 27 million that died in the Second World War. So, I mean, people are going missing. There are confessions that are signed with bloodstains on them. I mean, you know, the terror and the torture that occurred, you know. So if you were Nikolai Bukharin, you know, you would be thrown in prison. You'd be told, okay, here's your choice. Either you sign this confession and you're killed, or we kill you and your whole family. What are you going to do, right? I mean, it's brutal what happens. And those that are sent to the Gulag archipelago away the heck in the middle of Siberia end up being worked to death. So it might almost be a blessing just to be executed. But horrible period of roundups, accusations, show trials, of course, these public courtrooms, much like, almost like the McCarthy hearings is what it makes me think of, although in the McCarthy period people weren't executed. And essentially what Stalin is doing between 1934 and 38 is eliminating anybody that could be deemed a potential threat to him, particularly those people, as I've said before, who knew what he didn't do before the revolution and during. So, 1937, the military was purged, right? 75% of generals, 60 of 67% of corps commanders, 2/3 divisional commanders, and 1/3 of the regiment commanders. Joseph Stalin had decapitated the Soviet military on the eve of World War II. It is absolutely shocking. Now, what's interesting, there's some interesting conspiracy theories that suggest that the purges of the military, in particular, was instigated by the Nazis, because apparently the Nazis were looking at what was going on in the Soviet Union. Of course, we know Hitler looked at Stalin with a great degree of, hey, this guy knows how to deal with his enemies. He doesn't screw around. And apparently Reinhard Heydrich was the one who suggested, hey, why don't we send a memo to Stalin saying that we have information that many elements of your military are poised for a takeover. And Heydrich gets approval from Hitler. They send this letter out to Stalin or his agents in Moscow, and then this happens, right? And the Nazis are like, wow, that was easy. I don't know if that's actually been proven, but once again, I've read that in several accounts. So it's an interesting idea to think that the great purges, particularly of the military, might have been instigated by the Nazis of all people. What you see here, though, is all those people in the lower level positions that rose into these positions, guarantee you they are going to be loyal to Stalin. So that's essentially what he wanted, was to instill loyalty through brutality. Military, as I said, was beheaded on the eve of World War II, so quite a story. Now, we don't need to worry about this here. What I want you to do for just a moment is just to have a quick look at this photograph. Now, if you were to identify some adjectives, description words, of the general mood and tone of this picture, what would you say? Let's look at the faces. There are a couple people smirking. My gut reads fear. I think this picture really demonstrates the tension and the fear, because guaranteed all these people are constantly navigating what kind of relationship they have with this guy, right? So there's definitely, nobody's, you know, everyone's being very, very careful. So it's, I just find it a very telling picture. Now, despite the brutality and the horror of the Great Purges and collectivization and the Great Terror and the show trials and everything else that's going on in Russia, there's an incredibly lucid and pragmatic side to their foreign policy. Now, what's remarkable is that during the years of appeasement in Europe at the time, you know, the Soviets are never part of any of that stuff. They were never invited to any conferences. They were not invited to Munich. And, you know, there's a real sense that maybe the Soviets were being hung out to dry. And some historians believe, that the purpose of appeasement, that is, giving Hitler everything he wants to keep him satiated, and keep him satisfied, was to eventually hope that by appeasing Hitler, we push him east, and then the Soviets and the Nazis can duke it out and beat the heck out of each other, and we in the West can avoid a war altogether. Because we knew, and when I say we, I'm talking West, Britain, France, Canada, US, we knew that the Nazis were remilitarizing on a huge scale, despite the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. They were breaking all the rules. So let's have a look at what the Soviets had to say during all this stuff. Well, the first sign was the acceptance of the USSR into the League of Nations in 1934. And like the United States, Franklin Roosevelt came to the conclusion that if we continue to treat them like an enemy, they will behave like one. So let's rope them in, and maybe we can keep an eye on them. And I think the League of Nations recognized the benefits of making the Soviet Union feel like they are part of a community of nations in 1934. So they're in the League of Nations. And when the Soviet representative comes to Geneva, which is the headquarters of the League, a guy named Maxim Litvinov, everybody was going to go to this because they're fascinated. I mean, they have this image of these revolutionaries with beards and rifles and savages. And here comes Maxim Litvinov, this distinguished, well-spoken gentleman in a three-piece suit, comes to the podium, and he would pursue an anti-fascist alliance with the West and was committed to collective security, but no one listened. Here is one of the tremendous missed opportunities. When Litvinov gets to the podium, he says, I'll summarize briefly what he said. I've read the manuscript and there are parts of it, and it's chilling. Because what he says is something to this effect. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for including us in the League of Nations. We are very flattered and very excited to be part of this organization. We know that we've had a troubled history, but we want you to know that we are team players. We want to work with the West because we feel we have bigger fish to fry right now than anything in Central Europe. Nazi Germany is going to be a problem. They already are, and they will continue to be so. So I suggest that we, the Soviet Union, extend a hand and an olive branch to Britain and France and other players in forming an alliance to suppress the spread and militarization of Nazi Germany. And Britain and France, who are the two main players in the League, because of course the United States wasn't part of it, kind of say, yeah, interesting, we'll get back to you on that. The reason the West never followed up on this was because the West was more concerned about communist influence than they were about fascist influence. Because at least the fascists allowed private property, and at least the fascists cleaned up on labor problems, which is what I'm sure many Western governments would have liked to have done. They couldn't get away with it in the same way that the Nazis could, but I think at that time, it's not that the West were pro-Nazi, but of the two, they're gonna go to bed with the Nazis before the Soviets. So they put them off, and they said, thanks for the offer, Maxim, and we'll get back to you on that. Every year, they would continue to make this offer, but by September 1938, in the Munich Agreement, angered Russia, and Litvinov was replaced by Molotov, who of course would then be foreign minister for decades after this. Litvinov was released from his duties because he wasn't getting anywhere with the West in Geneva, and they were afraid, Stalin was afraid that his Jewish heritage would be seen as a liability now that the Soviets are beginning to think that they're going to have to come to terms with the Nazi Germany. After 4 years of trying to extend a hand to the West, the Soviet Union realized that they were being left out to dry, so they said, well, we're going to have some kind of agreement with the Nazis because we can't have them coming at us now. And certainly by 1938, this is only a year after the military purge in the Soviet Union, so the Soviet Union had a lot of work to do to get their military house in order. With a disinterested West, proven by the overtures of the Soviets in the League, Russia would sign the Nazi-Soviet Pact on August 24th, 1939. August 24th, 1 week before the Nazis invade Poland. So once Nazis got assurances from the Soviets that they were not going to go to war, that's when Hitler makes his move. So, of course, the Soviets get thrown under the bus by the West, who say, oh my gosh, can you believe it? He's teamed up with the Nazis. It was not a friendship agreement, it was a non-aggression pact. And I guess the West just was not able to recognize that maybe, just maybe, they had inadvertently pushed those two into this temporary alliance, which would actually hold until June 1941, when the Nazis would invade the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. But it does give Stalin's government roughly 2 years to get their military house in order. And I'll tell you, between this time and June of 41, the Soviets are working their buns off getting their military house in order. So, all right, and as I said, for World War II, I do have a 3-part series, and of course the Soviet Union figures quite significantly in that. So thank you again for enjoying this lecture, and if you have any comments, don't hesitate to let me know, and we will see you next time. Great, thank you.